The account of the cure of the man born blind is one of the most vivid in John's Gospel, not to be confused with the cure of, say, blind Bartimaeus. That was a man who had sight but became blind subsequently. No, this man was born blind. Now that's obviously going to require a miracle of an even greater magnitude than the cure of a blind man who previously had sight. It isn't so clear from the Gospel what the nature of this condition that causes him to be born blind is. But Maria Valtorta's visions give us a clear image of the deformity of this man's head, his face. And so we see the greatness of Jesus' miracle much more than we do in John's Gospel. But nonetheless, John's depiction, which goes throughout the entirety of chapter 9 of his Gospel, is extremely compelling. And it's a useful chapter or useful incident to refer to in this video, because it's not just, again, indicating how much more detail and much more picturesque the portrayal that we get through the vision that Jesus gives of what actually happened back then, 2,000 years ago. It also is a lesson in how the Catholic faith has been diminished over the past 50 or 60 years. We have a generalized disbelief in the trustworthiness of the Bible. A trustworthiness that's also lacking in when we just look at the New Testament accounts. And that's partly due, of course, to liberal German scholars of the 19th century, but most worryingly, it is due to liberalising Catholic scholars. Back in the beginning of the 20th century, Catholic scholars were given clear guidelines, or they were told where they must not go. But that no longer applied from the 1960s onwards. And just to take perhaps the most highly regarded biblical scholar of his day, Father Raymond Brown, who died in 1998. He was a figure in the Pontifical Biblical Commission. He specialised in St. John's Gospel. He also wrote a 2-volume set, well, I think it was a 1-volume set, The Birth of the Messiah, a 2-volume set, The Death of the Messiah. So he is really well-rounded, and justifiably so. But the problem is, his kind of scholarship is such that, though it's extremely good technically, like biblical scholars across the board, it seems to me, they go beyond the evidence and they make presumptions, and often those presumptions are detrimental to the Catholic faith. So we can say that in the hard sciences, the real sciences, you proceed often by experimentation, but in biblical studies, there's a lot of fashion. So you'll have heard of perhaps Rudolf Bultmann, who was the thing in the 1950s, but people aren't into Bultmann now. Does that mean then in the 50s people were stupid? Well, certainly somebody's following a fashion, either those who followed him then or those who refuse to follow him now. But it's really about taking the data and stretching the conclusions one can reach from that data. It's probably quite frustrating for a biblical scholar to have to decide that he cannot come to a conclusion, and so they often don't. I'm not really bothered about what Protestant scholars say. It's what Catholic scholars like Father Raymond Brown say, particularly when they're priests, because then we're open to trusting them, as we generally should be. Now, in the account of the cure of the man born blind, and you'll see that what John doesn't tell us, by the way, is that there's the machinations of Judas Iscariot behind all this, in the background. But just on the point about biblical studies. This is a good illustration of the problem. We have in John chapter 9 verse 22, it says, and this is now after the man's been cured and the parents have been summoned by the Pharisees and scribes because they're not happy. This man's been cured. Who's cured him? Because he doesn't know, you see. He was blind. And then Jesus disappears into the crowd again. But they're suspicious. And it says, I'll just pick it up from verse 20 then. How comes is it then that he's now able to see? His parents answered them, we can tell you that this is our son, and that he was blind when he was born. We cannot tell you how he's able to see now. We have no means of knowing who opened his eyes for him. Ask the man himself. He is of age. Let him tell you his own story. But St. John then says, it was fear of the Jews that made his parents talk in this way. The Jews had by now come to an agreement that anyone who acknowledged Jesus as the Christ should be forbidden the synagogue. That was why his parents said, he is of age, ask him himself. That is a central problem for people like Raymond Brown. I'm going to go into that a little bit more, but it enables me to say that one of the most important gifts of Jesus to us in the visions he gave to Maria Valtorta was in giving us the actual historical events in her visions, so that we can say, oh yes, this is reported in the gospel, but scholars question whether it happened, or they question whether Jesus said this or said that. But in Maria Valtorta's visions, Jesus does this and Jesus says this. And this is not the writing of a person who is told it by somebody else. This is Maria Valtorta herself who sees the event. She is a direct witness of the event. She's a first-class witness, no hearsay. So we know then we can trust the gospel account. Of course, we have to come to trust Maria Valtorta, but that's why before I started reading any of the gospel passages, I did about a dozen videos which talked about data within the visions and the writings in the quaderni, the notebooks, data which she could not have known, which could only be there by a supernatural force. Now it's up to you to say whether it's a supernatural force that is malign or benevolent, but it's obviously not malevolent, not malign, because it's encouraging you to accept the entire Catholic faith. Of course, if you're a born-again Protestant fundamentalist, you say, aha, yes, that shows it's from the devil. Okay, that may be a debate for another day. But honestly, even if you are the Reverend Ian Paisley himself, a Northern Ireland minister who was infamous from the 1960s through to his death some years ago, as a very much anti-Catholicism. He wasn't anti-Catholic, he was a fair man, not a bad man, an admirable man in many ways, but classically Protestant. And these people cannot avoid seeing that people are being drawn to Jesus by the writings of Maria Valtorta. This cannot be doing the devil's work, unless you believe that being a Catholic puts you in hell. I think even amongst the extreme Protestants, that's a minority opinion. So, given that these writings, I hope I've demonstrated, in those other videos I mentioned are trustworthy, then we can be sure that they are authenticating the gospel accounts. And I shall do other videos about other aspects of these writings which authenticate them in a scientific way. There are some articles which I want to bring to your attention and give some summaries of, but that's for another day. What I'll say here is that we Catholics need to be very, very wary of our own people who are called biblical scholars. I think you can be in safe hands when you read somebody like Scott Hahn or Brant Petrie, but you've got to be careful when you're reading, say, the footnotes of the Jerusalem Bible. Very careful. And I think it's the New American Bible's footnotes are notorious as well. This has corroded the faith of Catholics for more than a generation now, and it needs to be addressed. If it's not addressed, there's no future for us in the West, unless God intervenes, which he will. And I would, again, if I was talking about this, if this video was to be a mishmash, I'd talk about the prophetic writings that Maria Valtorta has given us from the words spoken to her by Jesus, but I won't do that. Not today. I'm just going to give you a flavour of Raymond Brown, because he is pretty much the most authoritative of our modern biblical scholars. So, if we take, for example, his 1966 magnum opus commentary on John's Gospel. This is the first volume of a 2-volume set, and it covers chapters 1 to 12. So on this point of verse 22 particularly, of chapter 9 of John's Gospel, here's what Father Brown said in 1966. In the parenthetical verses 22 to 23, we seem to have the final development of the apologetic use of this Johannine story. These verses may well represent the hand of an editor bringing the story up to date, for they are somewhat intrusive in the narrative. As we pointed out in the introduction, they help us to determine the earliest possible date for the Gospel in its present form, for they refer to the attempt around AD 90 to drive out from the synagogues Jews who had accepted Jesus as the Messiah. Just pause that for a moment. He says that those verses are somewhat intrusive in the narrative. Well, I don't see that. I think that's him reading into it. And you see now, he's placed John's Gospel in the year AD 90. Now, I've got to go through in a video at some point a excellent work which looks at the dates for the writings of all the books of the New Testament, all the letters of the New Testament as well, and comes to dates which are far, far lower than the convention. And it's done in a very systematic way. They're just assumptions about the dates. But this book drills down into it. Okay, so Raymond Brown saying it was about AD 90, the attempt to drive the Jews who believed in Jesus from the synagogues. He continues, it is quite possible that during the ministry, Jesus and his disciples met opposition in the synagogues and were handled roughly in the heat of debate. He gives an example, Luke 4, 28 to 29. But it is almost unbelievable that during Jesus' lifetime, a formal excommunication was levelled against those who followed him. Matthew 10:17 mentions being flogged in synagogues, but only as part of the future fate of Christian missionaries. Acts shows the apostles entering synagogues and even the temple itself without any suggestion that they have been excommunicated. Okay, there we have different circumstances. This is the apostles going in. Jesus is no longer around. He's been executed. The problem is finished with. That's the setting of Acts, or that initial part of Acts. And of course, the question is, how widespread was what is being said in chapter 9, verse 22 of John's Gospel? The decision that Jews who believe in Jesus must be kept away from the synagogue, and how rigorously was it enforced? Even the description of Jesus' followers in verse 22 as those who acknowledged that he was the Messiah is too formal for the ministry of Jesus. Is it? Let's see what 22 says again. The Jews had by now come to an agreement that anyone who acknowledged Jesus as the Christ should be forbidden the synagogue. I don't know what's too formal about that, but this is Father Brown's statement. Once again, the Gospel is showing us the ultimate development of the hostility that was incipient in Jesus' lifetime. The parents' fear of speaking represents the dilemma of those practicing Jews who believe that Jesus is the Messiah, but who now, i.e. the end of the first century, find that they can no longer profess this faith and remain Jews. So there's his conclusion. This is the dilemma of Jews who are living around the year AD 90 to 100. They are the believers in Jesus. They are the converts from Judaism. And they've got this problem. They can't access the synagogue. So what that means then, that John didn't write this gospel. This gospel was written by people long after John. Now I know there's a tradition we have that John lived to an old age. But that doesn't mean we should say his gospel was written when he was very old. We can easily say that his gospel was written quite early, within a few decades of our Lord's crucifixion, death and resurrection. But this analysis of Raymond Brown puts it way, way after the event. And of course that brings up the questions of John's memory, or who were these people who wrote after John or alongside John, and wasn't there a tendency to fluff up the whole account? Hence the very high Christology of John compared to that of the synoptics. By the way, in Hyde Park I've gone through the high Christology of the synoptics, so that's a kind of a mythical dichotomy, the low Christology of Matthew, Mark and Luke, and the high Christology of John. But it's true to say that John soars like an eagle. Jesus says this somewhere in the conversations he has with Maria Valtorta, or his dictations to Maria Valtorta. He sees things because of his spiritual maturity that Matthew, Mark and Luke don't see. Not that they're not true believers, it's just that John is on a higher level. So, rather than me critiquing Raymond Brown, let's see. Oh yes, and that was 1966, by the way. So, did he change? Well, I have here the New Jerome Biblical Commentary, of which he was one of the editors, and it's a very, very standard commentary, which huge numbers of Catholics involved in any academic work on the Bible would be aware of and will have relied on to some extent. And in itself, the point about it is it set the tone. If you look at that, you can see what biblical scholarship in Catholicism is like now. And this is page 967 of my volume. And it's paragraph number 130. It says, of verse 22 to 23, the parents' refusal to become further involved enables the evangelist to connect this story with the crisis that had been faced by members of the Johannine community. Very brief, because it's only a summary volume of every book of the Bible. So, the evangelist connects this story with the crisis that has been faced by members of the Johannine community. He doesn't say who the evangelist is, but as the Johannine community has faced a crisis, and that is in the late 1st century AD, this book must have reached its final form in the late 1st century AD. Now, we Catholics don't doubt that there is a hand other than John's here. We have the example of somebody other than John writing at the end of John's Gospel. We're at chapter 21, and it's, say, verse 20. We'll start with. Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following him, the same who leaned back on his breast at supper and asked, "Who is it that is to betray thee?" Seeing him, Peter asked Jesus, "And what of this man, Lord?" Jesus said to him, "If it is my will that he should wait till I come, what is it to thee? Do thou follow me." That was why the story went round among the brethren, that this disciple was not to die. But Jesus did not say, "He is not to die." He said, "If it is my will that he should wait till I come, what is it to thee?" It is the same disciple that bears witness of all this and has written the story of it. And here's the thing. And we know well that his witness is truthful. And it concludes, there is much else besides that Jesus did. If all of it were put in writing, I do not think the world itself would contain the books which would have to be written. Well, we have much of that in Maria Valtorta's writings. Yes, they are very fat volumes, but there we are. But the key thing is, we know well that his witness is truthful. It's interesting that they don't say we know well that his witness was truthful. So it seems to me that whoever's written that line, or those lines, is writing them or has written them during the lifetime of St. John. Maybe at this point John is in exile on Patmos, separated from those who are his own disciples. Who knows? But that the gospel was written at the time of, early on, much earlier than AD 90, is demonstrated by various other clues within the gospel. If I were to go into them, I would never get round to reading Maria Valtorta's vision. So that's what Raymond Brown says. So let's see what a scholar who's a Protestant says. In this book, The Historical Reliability of John's Gospel by Craig Blomberg, we have that point addressed. The point where it is alleged, because the Jews said the followers of Jesus would be cast out of the synagogue, therefore this can't be something which occurred at the time of Jesus' ministry and is so added on. And so we can't rely on this gospel, at least in this respect. But of course, you know, that casts a shadow on everything then. I'll read from the aftermath of the miracle of chapter 9. Blomberg says, verse 22 explains the reluctance of the parents to say any more. It is also one of the most historically suspect statements in the entire Gospel. Martin's influential two-level reading of John, from a 1979 book, which focuses primarily on what he believes was invented to address John's community at the end of the 1st century, takes its starting point from these texts. Numerous scholars have agreed with Martin that the so-called Birkat ha-Minim, that is the blessing, euphemistic for curse, against heretics, introduced into the 18th benediction of the synagogue liturgy, was developed at the Council of Jamnia in about AD 85 and had Jewish Christians specifically in view. Prior to this, it is argued, excommunication from the synagogues simply did not occur. What we read then in John is blatant anachronism. On the other hand, a spate of studies since the 1980s has questioned whether anything like a uniform, much less empire-wide curse on Christians was introduced at all this early. Even if it were, there is reason to question the claim that Christians were its primary target. In other words, if what John is describing in 9:22 and elsewhere is understood as an empire-wide edict, then no such ban had occurred even by the end of the 1st century, when his gospel was published. But if John's text is taken at face value to refer to an informal policy not necessarily adopted anywhere outside certain synagogues in Jerusalem during Jesus' lifetime, then the practice becomes far more plausible. After all, here was the centre of the strongest opposition to Christ, the place where he will be arraigned by the Sanhedrin within 6 months and be sentenced to die. The synoptic Jesus predicted synagogue expulsion for his followers. Luke 12:8-9, Mark 8:37, Luke 6:22-23. The consistent portrait of Acts is that hostility against the first Christians came from fellow Jews, starting from soon after Pentecost in AD 30. For those inclined to disbelieve Acts, Paul, in one of his earliest letters, speaks of past Jewish persecution of Jewish Christians in Judea. If indeed at least a few secret supporters of Jesus had begun to appear, even among the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem, it is not incredible that the parents of a man so spectacularly cured could begin to display the seeds of faith, but also fear reprisals for going too public with it. Not surprisingly then, an impressive number of recent commentators accepts the possible historicity of John 9:22, even if their arguments are still too often ignored by the critical establishment, and Blomberg puts establishment in inverted commas there. And then in a footnote he gives a list of a lot of such scholars. So to sum up, we have no reason to doubt, in this respect, the historicity of John's Gospel. And in fact, if I were to read the entire, or summarise the entire historical reliability of John's Gospel by Blomberg, you'd also see there's no reason to doubt the historicity of the entire Gospel. But of course, that's not what I'm here to do, not today anyway.